When last I left you, we had just started the Civil War. The first state to secede was which state? Which was the first state to secede? South Carolina. They were the first to go. And then other states like Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. They were the states that seceded, ultimately creating the Confederate States of America, and they chose this man to be their president. And who is that? What's his name? The first and only president of the Confederate States of America. He was a senator. He's from the state of Mississippi. Yeah, it's a pretty presidential sounding name. Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis. So the fighting ultimately begins at Fort Sumter, and it begins as a result of the Union. It was a Union fort, but Fort Sumter is located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. And the Confederacy wanted all Union troops to not be on their territory, in their country. And so basically it was going to be, a showdown, which occurs on April the 12th of 1861. When the South was kind of coerced into bombarding it for 34 hours. And the whole battle really wasn't much of a battle. No one died. No one died as a result of the 34 hours of shelling. I mean, it's a fort. It's supposed to be able to withhold some shelling. But the shelling of Fort Sumter electrifies the North. People want to join up and go fight, and sides begin to be chosen. And immediately following the shelling of Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln calls up for 75,000 militiamen. The Confederacy sees this as an act of war against them and sees Abraham Lincoln as a tyrant raising an army against them. So the South ultimately moves their capital to the city of Richmond, which is in Virginia, and it stays the capital of the Confederacy throughout the war. And Richmond's like a 1-hour drive from Washington, D.C. It's not very far. Excuse me. But not all states that had slavery stayed in the Confederacy or even seceded. States like Missouri and Kansas, a new state emerges out of the Civil War in the state of West Virginia. You may have heard of it. Maryland, Delaware, all these states had slavery. These are slave states and kept slavery all throughout the Civil War. However, they remained loyal to the Union. These states all stayed loyal to the Union. And some reasons for that is because of the war aims, the goals of war that Abraham Lincoln set forth at the beginning of the war. When war began, when the shelling of Fort Sumter happened and the South seceded, and 13 states, or 11 states, 13 states, I can't remember. My brain's not working. 11 states seceded from the United States of America. The whole purpose of going to war with them was to bring them back into the Union, to preserve the Union. At no point in 1861 did Abraham Lincoln say the reason why we're fighting is to end slavery. Okay? That doesn't happen until 1865, when the war aims begin to change, after when it looks like the victory is a little more certain. Because Abraham Lincoln knew if he says, okay, we're going to end slavery, and he says that at the beginning, all of these states would have remained loyal, or would have seceded. They would have not remained loyal to the Union. They would have seceded into the South. So, he was not going to ever publicly declare that he was fighting to free black people, because that would have been an unpopular thing. And it was, even when he did it in 1863, many people still found it very unpopular. So, he did not want to drive these border states into the welcoming arms of the South, because an anti-slavery war would have been very unpopular in these regions. So he makes it to where the war goals, the aim of the war was to save the Union at all costs, to save the Union. All right, even this is present-day Oklahoma, right here, present-day Oklahoma, but it was not Oklahoma at this time. What was it? All the people that used to live here were forced to go there. What is this territory? Indian Territory. And the Indian Territory actually also sided with the Confederacy. Many of the Native Americans here owned slaves themselves. So, the Confederacy even invited Native Americans to send delegates to their capital in Richmond to be a part of their government. And in return, the tribes, they were given a voice in the Confederate government, and in return, tribes sent, braves. They sent warriors to go fight. And the Confederacy actually had all Native American units that fought in the Civil War. Okay? So, just looking at it, when war breaks out, who should win? Who's going to win? Just looking at it from the outside, just on paper. Well, let's look at what it's like on paper. So, the South did seem to have some pretty big advantages, okay? They could fight defensively. They never had to invade anywhere. They said, we are our own country, and you just stay out. We're just going to stay here in our country. And they never had to leave their borders, okay? They did, much to their, one of the reasons why they lost. But they could fight a defensive war in their vast territory. Whereas the North had to invade. They had to invade the South in order to, drag it back into the Union. So another advantage the South had is they don't have to win in order to be successful. They already had their independence. They just had to tie at best, okay, because they seceded. They did not have to win. They just had to exist. So, that was definitely an advantage for the South. If they could just fight to a draw and stand firm, the Confederate independence would be won. So they also had the South also had a morale boost. They felt like they were fighting for a good cause, and they even the Southerners thought they were fighting a second American Revolution. They kind of compared themselves to patriotic heroes like Washington and Jefferson, and compared Abraham Lincoln to King George III as a tyrannical despot who's infringing on their civil rights and civil liberties. Another advantage is, militarily, the South had, the most talented officers, way more talent in terms of Southern officers. And a lot of this has to do with the education system. If you are super brilliant, if you're a brilliant mind and you live in the North, you're probably not going to go join the military. You're not going to you're not going to go to West Point. You're probably going to go to an Ivy League school, Harvard, Yale, Brown, Dartmouth, one of those schools. If you're in the South, the best education you can get is in military school. There's a lot of military schools in the South, VMI, the Citadel, places like that. And so the brightest minds from the South typically go to military school. And so you see, several first-rate commanders And among them, their best was General Robert E. Lee, who you probably know is from the United States Marine Corps, who halted John Brown's insurrection at Harper's Ferry. And at the beginning of the war, Abraham Lincoln actually asked Robert E. Lee if he would be the commander of the Union Army, as he was a member of the Union. But Robert E. Lee, being a Virginian, stayed loyal to his state as opposed to the United States. So he felt honor bound to go to with his native state. And Robert E. Lee lived in Arlington. Okay, today Robert E. Lee's home is Arlington National Cemetery, and there's a reason for that because during the Civil War there was a great amount of casualties. So the Union thought it would kind of be funny to just start burying bodies at Robert E. Lee's house, and so that's what they did. And now it's a national cemetery, like it's a historical landmark. So Lee's chief lieutenant was a man by the name of General Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson. He didn't get the name Stonewall until the war actually began. Very gifted military theorist and master of speed and deception. These are excellent military commanders. The North, on the other hand, had a great amount of ineptitude and incompetence. These things combined to make the war drag on even longer. And besides their brilliant leaders, ordinary Southerners were also kind of bred to fight, accustomed to managing horses and bearing arms from boyhood. They made excellent cavalrymen and foot soldiers. And, the South is really just one immense farm. But that is also a drawback for them because they have an extreme scarcity of factories. Very few factories in the South. But they do develop some ironworks during the war, like Tredegar. It's located in Richmond, Tredegar Ironworks, where they begin to produce and manufacture weapons and metal things on their own. But there's also a lot of weaknesses as well, and that one is a major one. The greatest weakness of the South is their economy. Because it's just like I said, it's just one big farm, and you can't eat cotton. I guess you could, but it wouldn't end up very well for you. Not only was the North a big farm in the grain states like Illinois and Ohio, and New York, lots of planting and growing things, Indiana, but it was also a sprawling factory as well. In terms of wealth, the North probably contained 75% of the nation's wealth, as opposed to the South having the rest. And most of that's tied up in just land and slaves. The North also controlled the sea, as it had a vastly superior navy, which at first it blockaded and hoped to choke off Southern supplies and eventually shatter Southern morale. But it's a mighty big coast and very difficult to patrol at all times. The Union also enjoyed a much, much, much greater population. So they had a larger reserve of manpower. The loyal states, the states that stayed loyal to the Union, had a population of about 22 million, whereas the seceding states had a population of about 9 million. And of that 9 million, it included about 3.5 million slaves. So, and adding to the North's overwhelming supply of soldiery were also an inpouring of immigrants daily from places like famine-struck Ireland. It's still difficult to overcome things there. Or the Irish continued to pour into the north during the war. There were entire brigades of Irish troops, entire brigades. People were literally like getting off a boat at New York Harbor, and they're hungry, and they're like starving, and they like hand them a musket and a uniform and sign them up, and then give them a bowl of soup, and then put them on another boat and send them like South Carolina so they go fight. So literally like, welcome to America. Now you're a soldier. Go fight. And there were entire brigades made up of Irish. Um, Not to mention British, German, but Irish were by far the largest in number. And many of them were kind of induced to enlist into the Union Army. Altogether, about 20% of the Union's of the Union soldiers, 20%, 1 out of 5 soldiers, were not born in the United States. They were born in a foreign country. They were immigrants. So 20% of our fighting force in the Union Army, foreign born. So that just gives you an idea of just how great a numbers of people were immigrating to the United States. We did mention that the South had greater military commanders, and that's a fact. But there were a couple good ones, like Ulysses S. Grant. Simpson is his middle name. Dope. Ulysses S. Grant. Kind of an interesting character. One of America's, some people claim, just a drunk. And he, after the Mexican-American War, he kind of drank himself because he was so bored. And then he was became a tailor in his wife's dad's store. I mean, I don't want to call him like a loser, but he had a tough go of it. And he really enjoyed war and fighting. But, he is a very successful military commander, and he's one of the North's best. Also from West Point, also experienced in the Mexican-American War. He knew Robert E. Lee personally. So there's a lot of might have beens going on here, like what ifs and why for, like what happens if there's a lot of that people like to do in the Civil War, like if the border states had seceded, or if the Mississippi Valley turned against the Union, or what if Britain or France had totally backed the South and gave them as much aid as they asked for. Would things have turned out any differently? And I really don't think it would have mattered. Because the fact that the economy was so different, and the North was so much more powerful than the South. It was kind of an inevitability, even though at the outset they didn't really know, and it was difficult, and it takes about 500,000 lives before they figure it out. But as the Civil War is the deadliest American conflict in American history. But you kind of see the different advantages and disadvantages that each side have, and you guys have questions on that. All right, last thing I want to talk to you about today is something. It actually happens a couple years into the war. All right, and so the next unit we'll go back to the beginning, but this is something that I wanted to talk to you about because we're talking about the massive numbers of immigrants, and this is the New York City draft riot. The New York City draft riot. Okay, so I mentioned to you that 20% of all the fighting soldiers for the Union were immigrants. Well, there's some reasons for that. Okay, one is they really had no option, and they're hungry, and they were they just arrived in New York. Some other options for that is because as a result of the draft order that President Lincoln created, where people were being drafted, you could buy your way out of it for $300. So if you were drafted, you show up at the draft board to either show up to fight or you bring them $300 and you don't have to go fight. Is that what do you guys think about that? In other words, who doesn't have to fight? Rich people. But $300 doesn't seem like a lot. That's a lot of money, okay? Especially if you're a poor immigrant, okay? That's a lot of money then. So rich people could pay their $300, or they could hire a substitute to go fight in their stead. So these rich people, or $300 men, as they were scornfully called, didn't have to fight. Who does have to go fight? Poor people. And the largest, vastest numbers of poor people in New York City were the Irish, as this is the time of nativism and anti-Catholicism, and no Irish need apply. Remember those signs? It's a tough go for the Irish. And so now they see those wealthy, white Protestant people not having to go fight, and then they have to go fight, and so they were extremely unhappy with this. They were unhappy with Abraham Lincoln. They were unhappy with the Union, and so they rioted. And they aimed their rioting at, African Americans. They kind of blamed them, saying we're not going to go fight to free the slaves, but just so that we have to compete with them for the jobs that we can't even get. Because if slavery no longer existed, it would just create more competition for the bad jobs that they already are trying to get. So this riot breaks out in 1863 by underprivileged Irish Americans who shouted, "Down with Lincoln, down with the draft." Scores of lives were lost in this time. Most of the victims were black people who were lynched, literally by lampposts in the street. They set the draft house on fire. And eventually the United States military is called on them. The Union troops have to go and open fire on these rioters to get them to stop. Now, don't get me wrong, more than 90% of the troops in the Union Army were volunteers. They didn't get drafted, but 10% were drafted, all right? And the act that was created by Congress that created this draft is called the Conscription Act. And it has all those aspects of it that the Irish really didn't like, the $300 thing. So the rich get to decide to have war, but the poor have to go fight it. It was a rich man's fight, but a poor man's battle. A rich man's war, but a poor man's battle. Okay? So, you can just kind of imagine how volatile things were in the United States at this time. Riots going on, literally brother shooting brother. An entire race of people enslaved. And imagine being a president and trying to keep it all together. All right, and that's some of the things that we're going to look at when we get into the next unit. When we talk, and we'll do the battle. I'm not going to get too in depth with the battles. Like we'll tell you about a few important ones, like turning point battles. But I'm not going to do like military tactics or anything, because you're not going to be expected to know that on your test. But we will look at how some commanders were good and how some were bad, and what decisions they made that made them good or bad. Okay? All right, so you guys have any questions? Anybody at home have questions, feel free to contact me.